November 1941, Western Desert, North Africa. The horizon shimmered like a mirage, waves of heat rising from sand that stretched endlessly in every direction. A merciless sun hung in a cloudless sky, baking the earth to temperatures that warped perception and judgment alike. In this forbidding wasteland, two great armies faced each other across a sea of sand, their very presence an act of defiance against nature itself. Yet behind the tanks, artillery and infantry that made headlines, another battle raged. One fought not with bullets and shells, but with shovels, pumps, and an intimate understanding of the desert's secrets. This was the domain of the Royal Engineers, the sappers whose invisible war against the land itself would ultimately determine who controlled North Africa. Captain James Harrington wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of grime across his sun-darkened face. 6 months in this hellscape had weathered him like driftwood, his once soft academic hands now calloused and cracked from endless labor. He squinted through his field glasses, surveying the depression before him, where 20 men struggled with equipment that seemed absurdly delicate for a theater of war. Sand infiltrated everything: weapons, engines, food, water, and most critically, the precious survey equipment they needed for their current mission. The desert was not merely a backdrop to the conflict, it was an active, hostile participant that claimed more casualties than enemy action. "Water tables deeper than we thought, sir," Lieutenant Wilson reported, his Australian drawl made raspier by thirst. "Another 15 feet at least by my calculations." The news hung between them, its implications clear. Without water, the planned advance of the 8th Army would stall before it began. Field Marshal Montgomery's ambitious offensive to break Rommel's line hinged on these men finding what existed in abundance just miles away across the Mediterranean, but remained frustratingly elusive here beneath the burning sands. In war, glory belonged to those who advanced or held ground against overwhelming odds. Songs were not sung about the men who secured supply lines, built desert runways from nothing but sand and determination, or spent endless hours searching for the subterranean water that meant the difference between victory and defeat. Yet as the African campaign had proven repeatedly, armies that neglected their engineers quickly found themselves immobilized, thirsting, and vulnerable to an enemy who better understood this unforgiving environment. The morning of July 5, 1942, dawned blood-red over the Qattara Depression, a vast salt marsh south of El Alamein that formed a natural barrier no army could cross. Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Spencer studied the topographical maps spread before him in the relative cool of his command tent. Spencer had been a civil engineer in Yorkshire before the war, building bridges and roadways across terrain that now seemed laughably cooperative compared to the Western Desert. He was a methodical man, more at home with angles and load calculations than military strategy, but he had come to understand that in this theater, they were one and the same. "Rommel's forces will have to funnel through here." He indicated a narrow corridor between minefields to the north and the impassable depression to the south. "He doesn't have the fuel to go around. Our job is to make this ground work against him." His finger traced the contour lines that told a story invisible to the naked eye. Slight depressions where flash floods might channel during the rare desert rains, areas where the sand concealed harder ground beneath, locations where even shallow digging would hit bedrock. The desert revealed its secrets only to those who knew how to read them, and Spencer had become one of its most fluent interpreters. Outside, the temperature climbed toward 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men worked in shifts of 20 minutes, retreating to whatever shade they could find before heat exhaustion claimed them. Water was rationed more strictly than ammunition. The 8th Army had learned brutal lessons about desert logistics in their earlier defeats, lessons written in the dried blood of men who had died more from thirst than wounds. Now as they prepared to make their stand at El Alamein, the final defensive line before Alexandria and the Nile Delta, those lessons were being applied with desperate thoroughness. The engineers had constructed a network of water points, each one a small miracle of persistence against the desert's hostility. They had learned to find water where none seemed possible, drilling deep into ancient aquifers, filtering brackish pools, even condensing moisture from the air during the surprisingly humid nights. Water discipline had become a religion, with carefully calculated rations for men and machines alike. Every drop was precious, every waste punishable. Men learned to shave with a cupful, to wash with dampened cloths, to drink in measured sips rather than satisfying gulps. The water trucks became the most valuable and protected vehicles in the entire army, their routes planned with the same precision as any combat operation. Sergeant Thomas Kelly led a team operating a mobile drilling rig that could bore through sand and rock in search of water. Kelly had been a miner in civilian life, comfortable with the rhythms of the earth and the particular sounds that signaled what lay beneath. "She's singing to us now," he murmured as the drill bit deeper, the vibrations changing in pitch as it encountered different layers. His men exchanged glances. They had learned to trust Kelly's uncanny sense for what lay underfoot. The desert might be inscrutable to most, but to Kelly it spoke in a language of resistance and yield that told him where its treasures were hidden. Kelly's team had been drilling since dawn, the monotonous whine of the machinery a constant background to their labors. The rig itself was a marvel of adaptation, originally designed for mineral exploration in South African mines, now modified to seek a resource more valuable than gold in this parched landscape. Its engine had been fitted with specialized cooling systems and air filters to cope with the desert conditions. The drill bits were constantly sharpened and replaced as the abrasive sand wore them down at an alarming rate. Even the drilling mud used to lubricate the bore had been reformulated to minimize water usage while maintaining efficiency. "There's something different here," Kelly said suddenly, pressing his palm against the drill stem to feel its vibration more clearly. The resistance changed. His assistant, a former plumber from Manchester named Davies, checked the pressure gauges and nodded confirmation. "Layer change at 43 feet, Sarge." The team's geologist, a young lieutenant fresh from university, consulted his charts. "We might be hitting the limestone aquifer. If we're lucky, it'll be saturated." The men exchanged glances of cautious hope. Water had been found in this region before, but never in quantity sufficient to support a major offensive. If they struck a productive aquifer now, it could change the entire strategic picture. The Africa Corps had initially seemed invincible in the desert, their tactics perfectly suited to this environment of maneuver and counterattack. Yet, as the conflict dragged on, it became clear that their greatest vulnerability was not the British Army, but the tyranny of distance and the desert itself. Every gallon of fuel, every round of ammunition, every drop of water had to travel across a Mediterranean dominated by British naval and air power, or along vulnerable coastal roads where supply convoys fell prey to raids. German engineering, for all its vaunted efficiency, struggled against problems that defied conventional solutions. How to cool engines designed for European conditions when thermometers burst in the shade. How to keep dust from infiltrating precision mechanisms. How to maintain vehicles when spare parts were an ocean away. The British, drawing on colonial experience and the vast resources of their empire, gradually developed answers that the Germans could not match. The humble jerrycan, ironically copied from superior German designs, allowed fuel to be transported and stored with minimal loss to evaporation. Water condensers extracted precious moisture from the air. Special filters kept engines breathing despite the omnipresent sand. And perhaps most importantly, a network of Royal Engineer units mapped, modified, and mastered the terrain in ways that transformed it from enemy to ally. The engineers became experts in deception as well as construction. They created false trails that led into impassable terrain, built dummy water points to draw enemy attention away from real ones, and established mock supply dumps that attracted Luftwaffe bombers, while the genuine articles remained camouflaged and untouched. They learned to read the desert floor like a book, identifying areas where the surface could support heavy vehicles and others where tanks would bog down in treacherous soft sand. This knowledge was translated into elaborate route maps that guided Allied movements with a precision that baffled the enemy, who often found themselves outflanked by forces that seemed to materialize from impossible directions. The relationship between engineers and intelligence units grew increasingly symbiotic as the campaign progressed. Information about terrain conditions became as valuable as enemy troop dispositions. Aerial reconnaissance photographs were scrutinized not just for signs of enemy activity, but for indications of soil composition, drainage patterns, and hidden obstacles. Captured German maps were treasured, not for their tactical markings, but for the terrain data they contained. The Desert Rats, as the British 7th Armoured Division became known, developed a sixth sense for which routes would support their vehicles and which would leave them bogged down and vulnerable. This knowledge was not innate, but painstakingly assembled by generations of survey teams who measured, mapped, and classified every inch of the battlefield. Dawn, October 23, 1942. Operation Lightfoot began with one of the most intensive artillery barrages of the war, over 1,000 guns announcing the beginning of Montgomery's offensive. But hours before the first shell fell, men like Captain Harrington and his sappers were already deep in enemy territory. Their mission was among the most dangerous of the campaign, clearing paths through vast minefields in the darkness, using only their hands and the most basic tools to disarm devices designed to maim and kill. The Germans had laid nearly 500,000 mines in defensive belts, many of them the feared Tellermine that could destroy a tank, or the vicious S-mines that jumped to waist height before exploding in a spray of lethal fragments. Each mine had to be found by probing the sand with bayonets, carefully excavated and disarmed by hand. It was painstaking work that demanded absolute concentration despite exhaustion, thirst, and the knowledge that enemy patrols might discover them at any moment. Harrington had lost count of the mines his team had cleared over the past months. Each one represented a life potentially saved. Each one increased the odds of Allied success. But each one also extracted a toll from the men who handled death so intimately. The sappers developed strange superstitions, never speaking the word mine, but using euphemisms like eggs or presents, carrying personal talismans ranging from religious medals to odd pebbles found in meaningful places, performing small rituals before beginning each clearing operation. Harrington did not discourage these practices. In a task where a moment's inattention could be fatal, anything that helped maintain focus was valuable. Harrington's men moved forward in a practiced pattern, their movements economical and precise. They had trained for months for this night, developing techniques that became muscle memory. Still, nothing could completely prepare a man for the moment when his probing bayonet struck something solid beneath the sand. Each discovery brought a surge of adrenaline and the cold clarity of focused fear. One mistake would mean death or mutilation. "Tell her at 2 o'clock, sir," whispered Corporal Jenkins, freezing in position. Harrington crawled forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The desert night had grown cold, yet sweat trickled down his spine as he carefully brushed away sand to reveal the deadly disc. With practiced movements, he located the detonator and carefully, oh so carefully, extracted it from its housing. One mine disarmed, countless more ahead. The Tellermines were particularly feared for their sophisticated anti-handling devices that could detect attempts to disarm them. Early in the campaign, many experienced sappers had been lost to these treacherous mechanisms. Through bitter experience, the engineers had developed counter-miashes, specialized tools that could neutralize the anti-handling devices, techniques for approaching the mines from specific angles to avoid triggering secondary detonators, even methods for using controlled explosions to safely destroy mines that could not be disarmed. These techniques were passed from veteran to novice in an oral tradition of survival, often taught in whispers during the long desert nights between operations. By dawn, 8 lanes had been cleared through the minefields, each just wide enough for tanks to pass in single file. The sappers marked these paths with white tape that would guide the armored spearhead of the 8th Army. Their work had been completed at a terrible cost. 1 in 4 sappers had become casualties during the night, their sacrifice unmarked by any monument save the safe passage they created for the fighting forces that would make headlines. The battle raged for days, a grinding contest of attrition rather than the fluid desert warfare of earlier campaigns. When it finally ended in British victory, much would be made of Montgomery's generalship, the overwhelming Allied material advantage, and the courage of the fighting troops. Rarely mentioned were the feats of engineering that made it all possible. The supply roads built and maintained despite sandstorms, the water points that kept men and machines functioning in hellish heat, the minefields cleared and laid, the bridges constructed over wadis that could transform from dusty depressions to raging torrents during flash floods. The engineers' innovation extended to the very weapons of war. When conventional anti-tank obstacles proved ineffective in the soft sand, they developed new designs that sank deep foundations into the desert floor. When standard camouflage techniques failed against aerial observation in the stark landscape, they pioneered new methods of concealment that mimicked the natural patterns of the desert. They even adapted captured enemy equipment, turning the Germans' own engineering prowess against them by repurposing abandoned vehicles and weaponry. The victory at El Alamein represented a turning point, not just in the Desert War, but in the engineers' approach to their craft. They had moved beyond simply reacting to challenges and begun to actively shape the battlefield. Their water supply systems no longer merely sustained existing forces, but enabled offensive operations previously thought impossible. Their transportation networks didn't just connect established positions, but opened new avenues of attack. Their fortifications weren't merely defensive, but channeled enemy forces into killing zones. Engineering had evolved from a support function to a form of weaponry in its own right, less dramatic than artillery or air power, but equally decisive in its impact. December 1942 found Major Spencer, newly promoted after El Alamein, facing a different challenge altogether. The Eighth Army's pursuit of the retreating Afrika Korps had brought them to Tunisia, where winter rains transformed the battlefield from parched desert to clinging mud. Vehicles that had been modified for sand now found themselves bogged down in swamps. Roads collapsed under the weight of traffic. Supply lines stretched to breaking point across terrain that seemed determined to swallow men and materials alike. "We need a miracle, gentlemen," Spencer told his officers, as rain drummed on the roof of their makeshift headquarters. "Or failing that, we need every ounce of ingenuity you possess." The push to cut off Rommel's retreat had reached a critical juncture. If the Germans could consolidate their defenses in the Tunisian mountains, the campaign might drag on indefinitely. If the Allies could maintain their momentum, total victory in North Africa was within reach. The transition from desert to muddy terrain represented more than just a change in working conditions. It required a fundamental shift in engineering philosophy. In the desert, the challenge had been to find or create resources where none existed naturally. In Tunisia, the problem was managing an overabundance, controlling water flow, preventing erosion, maintaining stability in saturated ground. Equipment optimized for digging through sand now struggled with clay and rock. Bridging techniques developed for dry wadis proved inadequate for swollen rivers with powerful currents. Even the engineers' personal equipment, boots, clothing, tools, needed modification for the new environment. The solution came not from formal engineering manuals, but from the collective experience of men who had spent their lives building, maintaining, and improvising. Local materials, olive trees, stone from abandoned buildings, gravel from dry riverbeds, were incorporated into road surfaces that could bear the weight of tanks even in sodden conditions. Drainage systems inspired by ancient Roman designs were implemented alongside modern construction techniques. When conventional bridging equipment proved inadequate for the fast-flowing wadis, Spencer's men developed floating bridges using empty fuel drums as pontoons. The engineers worked around the clock, their efforts often accompanied by enemy artillery fire directed precisely at the infrastructure they were struggling to create. They became experts at rapid repair, developing techniques to quickly patch damaged roads and bridges, even while under direct attack. They learned to anticipate which routes would be targeted and prepared alternative paths in advance, creating redundancy that frustrated enemy attempts to halt the Allied advance through destruction of key choke points. The sappers developed a particular relationship with local populations that differed markedly from that of combat troops. Their work often directly benefited civilians, improving roads, repairing water systems, rebuilding bridges, creating a foundation of goodwill that yielded valuable intelligence and assistance. Local laborers were recruited not just for their muscle, but for their intimate knowledge of the terrain. Ancient techniques for managing water and building on difficult ground, passed down through generations, were incorporated into modern military engineering. The Romans had conquered this land 2 millennia earlier, and their ruined aqueducts and roads still offered lessons to their modern counterparts. Meanwhile, across the battlefield, German combat engineers, the Pioniere, were performing their own feats of improvisation. Hauptmann Friedrich Müller had once built autobahns across Germany, precise highways designed to last generations. Now he found himself creating defensive positions from whatever materials came to hand. His training in systematic German engineering adapted to desperate circumstances. His men packed explosives into ancient olive trees to create obstacles when they fell. They diverted streams to flood Allied approach routes. They set booby trap after booby trap to slow the inevitable advance. There was a strange respect between opposing engineers, a recognition of shared challenges that transcended the enmity of nations at war. They studied each other's work with professional interest, learning and adapting in a continuous cycle of innovation. A well-designed German defensive position might be noted, and its principles incorporated into British fieldworks. A British technique for rapidly repairing cratered roads might find itself replicated by German pioneers. In this specialized domain of warfare, effectiveness mattered more than origin. The Germans proved particularly adept at defensive engineering, transforming the rugged Tunisian landscape into a fortress that extracted a heavy toll from advancing Allied forces. They integrated natural features into their defensive schemes with impressive skill, positioning artillery on reverse slopes to avoid detection, using limestone ridges as ready-made tank obstacles, establishing observation posts in caves that were nearly impervious to artillery fire. Even in retreat, their systematic approach to obstacle creation slowed the Allied advance to a crawl in many sectors, buying time for their forces to establish new defensive lines further back. April 1943, the campaign neared its conclusion. Allied forces had squeezed Axis troops into an ever-shrinking pocket in northeastern Tunisia. Captain Harrington, now a veteran with hollow eyes and a permanent coat of dust ground into his skin, found himself leading his company in one final engineering challenge, creating assault crossings over a series of ravines that protected the German positions. The terrain heavily favored the defenders, with clear fields of fire covering any approach. "We go in tonight," Harrington told his men. "No moon, cloud cover expected. We'll be laying the bridges while the infantry provides what cover they can." The men nodded, their faces impassive, but their eyes revealing the calculation every combat soldier makes, measuring the objective against the likely cost in lives. They had become fatalists of a sort, accepting that their role required them to work in the most exposed positions, often without the ability to shoot back. Harrington studied the terrain models his reconnaissance teams had constructed, searching for